In this lesson, we will continue learning about the features of SASS. We've saved arguably the best for last. In this lesson, we will learn about mix-ins and operators. Let's start with mix-ins. Mix-ins are incredibly powerful. They are my favorite feature of SASS. But before we dig into code, let's first give ourselves a goal. Let's imagine that we want this alternate button to use a background that is a gradient, so it fades gradually from one color to another. Now, we learned earlier in the course that if we want to create a gradient with CSS code that works in almost every browser and device, we have to repeat ourselves many times. There's the old WebKit way, there's the new WebKit way, there's the Mozilla way, the Microsoft way, the Opera way, the default modern way, the old crazy Microsoft way. So that's a lot of code to write. And at the end of the day, all of those lines of code are achieving the exact same thing. They're fading from one color to another. So wouldn't it be nice if there was some sort of tool or function that could receive the two colors and then output all of those lines of code automatically? Well, we can create that tool using SASS mix-ins. So here we are in the text editor. We are editing our sassy CSS file, and let's create our first mix-in. We begin by typing the @ symbol and then the word mixin. We then have a chance to name our mixin. So I will name this vertical gradient. Now, if you've ever created a function in another programming language, this is very similar. So I'm then going to type parentheses and then curly brackets. So we wanted to create a gradient. So between the curly brackets, I will say background image, linear gradient, begin at the top, and then we can specify our colors. So let's start with white and then transition to black. However, we likely do not want to hard code the color values into our mixin because we want our mixin to be as flexible as possible. So instead of these color values of white and black, let's include parameters named fromColor and toColor. Back on this line of code, when we named our mixin, within the parentheses, we will also include the parameters. fromColor, toColor. Now our mixin is far from complete, but it is ready to begin testing. So let's see if we can use this mixin on the button B rule. So let's remove this background color and try to add a gradient background using our new mixin. So I will include the @ symbol and the phrase include. This is how we call a mixin. So then we just type the name of the mixin that we want to use. Vertical gradient. Now when we created our mixin, we gave it two parameters. So now that we're actually calling and using the mixin, we can pass along two arguments. Or in other words, the two colors that we want to fade between. So let's say the fromColor should be blue and the toColor should be red. So if I save and refresh in the browser, we see that I clearly made a mistake somewhere. So instead of top, this should be to bottom. So this is a great example of why we want to use a mixin for gradients in the first place. The syntax to create gradients with CSS has evolved over the years, and there's different versions floating around to please different browsers and devices. So the idea is that we don't want to have to write this code every time we want a gradient. We want to be able to create one mixin, maybe every 6 months or every year, and then just call the mixin whenever we need to use a gradient. So with this updated syntax in place, the code should now work in the most recent version of Firefox. So if we refresh, there's the gradient. Let's take a quick look at the CSS that the SASS compiler output. So here is the button B rule in the output CSS file. So the compiler took this include vertical gradient call, and it took our arguments, and it output this code. Now our mixin is not complete, so obviously outputting only one line of code is not very impressive. We could have done this on our own. So let's go and complete our mixin. We don't want it to only output one line of code for gradients. We want it to output all of those nasty, miserable to type, cross-browser compatibility lines so that we can have gradients in every device under the sun, even if they're terribly outdated. Now instead of typing out all of those lines, which would bore both of us to death, I'm just going to paste in a chunk of code. So all that's going on here is we're providing all of the different syntaxes. So here's the old WebKit way, the new WebKit way, the old Mozilla way, Microsoft Opera, the modern way, the crazy old Microsoft way. You get the idea. And instead of hard coding in color values, we used the parameters of FromColor and ToColor for all of the lines of code. So now, if I save, and we take a look at the CSS that the SASS compiler output, it's much more impressive. So all of this was created by this one line of code. We're saying include the vertical gradient mix-in and pass it arguments of blue and red. And the SASS compiler did all of this work for us. So now if we decide, actually instead of blue and red, the button should have a gradient of white to orange. All we have to do in our sassy CSS file is adjust this line of code to say white and orange. And when we save, the SASS compiler re-outputs all of those nasty repetitive lines, and every browser is happy. And perhaps most importantly, we as developers are happy because we only have to write one line of code. We don't need to ever look at or revisit this mix-in source code unless gradient syntax changes in major browsers. So we can reuse this mixing code in all of our website projects. And we can actually tuck it away in its own partial file and then import that. So I'm going to copy or cut this code. Let's create a new file in our CSS folder, paste in the code. Let's save this file as _mixins.scss. And then back in our main Sassy style sheet where that code used to live, we can say @import mixins semicolon. Out of sight, out of mind. So now we don't even need to worry and waste precious brain cells thinking about all of this disgusting cross-browser code. We tuck it away in its own file, we import that file, and we can pretend that our vertical gradient mixin is just a part of native SASS language. Very quickly, I want to point out the power of combining mixins with something we learned about in our previous lesson, variables. So let's imagine we decide that this button should not use a gradient of white to orange, but instead white to a lighter shade of our baseline blue. Now we know that we're storing that baseline blue color in a variable named beautiful hue. And if we decide the baseline blue is too dark, we can use a function that we learned about in the previous lesson named lighten. Pass it the beautiful hue color and say make it 30% lighter. So if I save and refresh in the web browser, we can see that with a single line of code, we were able to create a cross-browser CSS gradient using a variable color and dynamically lighten that color by 30%. This is thanks to variables and color functions, but most importantly, this is thanks to mix-ins. So the gradient demo is one example of how mix-ins can make our life easier. Now I want to show you a second example. So let's give ourselves a new goal. Let's imagine that we want this layout to be responsive. And once we get down to about the form factor of a smartphone, we want our navigation links to sit one per line. Now we've learned about responsive web design and media queries in a previous lesson. So from a technology standpoint, we know what to do. We would head over to our header style sheet. This is where all of our header related styles live. And we would simply create a new media query, media, only screen, and max width of 480 pixels. And then we would target whatever element we needed to target. So in this case, the site, header, nav, list item. And in this case, we wanted them to be full width. So we would tell them to no longer be floated. We would remove the margin right. So from a technology standpoint, we know that this is how we include media queries. This is how we please the web browser. But does this please us as a developer? Is this how we want to write our style sheets? Does this code syntax make sense conceptually, or could we use mix-ins to improve our experience as a coder? The answer is most definitely yes. Mix-ins can improve our media query experience. So I'm going to delete this code, head over to our mix-ins partial file. So here is the gradient code that we created earlier. I'm going to go to the bottom, create a comment that reads media query mix-ins. And let's get started on our media query mix-in. @ mix-in. I'm going to name this mix-in breakpoint baby bear. Within the curly brackets, I will include the code to create a media query. So media, only screen, and max width, 480 pixels. Now again, we want mix-ins to be flexible. We want them to be an empty container that we pass content into later. So within this media query, I'm not going to target any elements or add any properties. I'm simply going to include the @ symbol and say content. While I am still in the mix-ins partial file, I'm going to copy this code that we just wrote, paste it. So we're creating a second mix-in, and I'll give this one a name of breakpoint papa bear. And I'll change its media query condition to min width 1100 pixels. So now that we've created these two media query mix-ins, I'm going to head back over to our header SCSS file. And let's remember our goal was to style the navigation links so that for smaller screens, they sit one per line. So within our original baseline rule for list items in the navigation, I can simply say include, use the mix-in that we just created, so breakpoint baby bear, float none, margin right 0, margin bottom 2 pixels. So I will save our header partial file, and in our main screen SASS style sheet, I'll make sure that our import of the mix-ins file sits towards the top of our style sheet, so that the mix-ins are available by the time we use them in the header file. So if we save, when we refresh, we see that our mobile styles are in place. So let's review the newfound freedom that our mix-in offers us. Within the rule for the list item, we included our mix-in, breakpoint baby bear. By simply nesting this mix-in within the rule for the list item, the SASS compiler takes care of the rest. So you will notice that within this media query, we didn't have to select which element we wanted to style. The nesting takes care of that for us. So conceptually, this is much simpler. It feels much more natural. We're styling the list items. Here are our baseline styles. Here are our baby bear styles. Now let's imagine that for larger screens, or screens that are wider than 1100 pixels, we want there to be more margin between each link. So because we created the papa bear mix-in, it's as simple as staying within this list item rule and saying include breakpoint papa bear margin right 50 pixels. So if we save here and also save within our main SASS style sheet to trigger the SASS compiler, when we refresh, if I resize my window to be larger than 1100 pixels, we see the margin increases. Now this mix-in approach of handling media queries offers two primary advantages. Number one, it centralizes our media query conditions. So conceptually, we can create different breakpoints. Baby bear is this size, papa bear is this size. If you wanted to create mama bear as an in-between size or Goldilocks as an in-between size, that's up to you. You can have as many different breakpoints as you want. But the idea is that you're only setting these breakpoint values once within your mix-in. So that when you're authoring your actual styles, you don't need to be a robot remembering these exact max width 480 or min width 1100. Instead, you can conceptually remember baby bear, papa bear, mama bear, Goldilocks, these keywords that you've defined. And then anywhere in your style sheet, you can use them. So let's imagine that we want to use a larger baseline font size for large screens and a smaller baseline font size for small screens. It's as simple as editing our HTML rule in our main style sheet. So I can say include breakpoint baby bear font size 0.8 EM, include breakpoint Papa Bear, font size 1.4 EM. So when we save and refresh, you can see here are the Papa Bear or large screen styles. Here are the normal styles. And here are the Baby Bear styles. So we can see the font size changes accordingly. So again, the primary advantage of using mix-ins for media queries is that you don't need to memorize your breakpoints. You set them once in the mix-in, and then you can forget about them and instead just focus on the naming scheme that you've created. The second advantage is that we can conceptually group all styles related to an element within one rule. We don't need to create completely separate media queries where we reselect the elements we want to style. We can conceptually stay focused on one piece of content and style it at the different breakpoints. So this will conclude our section on mix-ins. Hopefully I've convinced you that they are very useful and you are hungry to use them in your own projects. Now very quickly I must point out that all of the mix-ins we looked at, we created ourselves by hand. Now while this is certainly useful, mix-ins really come alive when we realize that there's an entire community of brilliant minds creating and sharing their own mix-ins that you can leverage for free. There are entire SASS frameworks bursting at the seams with powerful mix-ins, skeletons for variables, custom functions, and these community frameworks will make the examples that we saw in this lesson look like child's play. So if you're hungry to learn more about SASS, I strongly encourage you to check out some of the community's top frameworks like Compass, Bourbon, and Suzy. Now, not only are these frameworks powerful and flexible, but they're also continuously updated. So for example, the frameworks will have a gradient mix-in, and if browser syntax changes so we need different code to create gradients, you don't need to worry about it. As long as you're using the framework's gradient mix-in, the community will update the framework and address the syntax changes so you can go along on your merry way using the framework's mix-in as if nothing changed. So that's enough on mix-ins. Now let's change gears and talk about operators. More specifically, let's take a look at mathematical operators to get your feet wet. So if you've ever thought, I wish I could perform basic arithmetic in my style sheets, you're in luck. With SASS, we can. So here is a rule in our style sheet for an element with a class of box. And on our web page, that corresponds with this gray box. It currently has a width of 150 pixels. Now in elementary math, your teachers always told you to show your work. And the same applies in web design. There will be times when you're calculating the perfect width, whether it's pixels or percentages, and you don't want to end up with a value where you can't remember how you got to that value. So instead, we can include math directly in our style sheets. So we can say 100 pixels plus 200 pixels. If we save and look at the CSS that the compiler created, we see a width of 300 pixels. So addition and subtraction are pieces of cake. We can also perform division. So we could say 500 pixels divided by 2. And when you use division, you often want to make sure that you wrap it in parentheses. So if we save, the SASS compiler will return a value of 250 pixels. And the symbol for multiplication is the asterisk. So we can try 300 pixels times 2. And we see that the SASS compiler is trustworthy. 600 pixels. Now I will let you use your imagination to think of the ways that math would be useful in your style sheets. The reason I showed you the basics here isn't so much math for the sake of math, but it's to remind you that SASS is a complete programming language. So this includes math or number operators, logical operators, control directives and expressions. There is a lot to sink your teeth into with SASS. And if you come from a programming background, or if you want to learn more about programming, there is a lot to be excited about with SASS. Now I want to point out that you don't need to wait until you're a SASS guru to begin using it in your web projects. I encourage everyone to experiment with what we've learned in these lessons, and if and when you want to learn more, check out the official sass-lang.com website, or also visit thesassway.com. Have fun! SASS is an amazing extension language.